talk about cannabis. And when we refer to cannabis, we are indeed referring to marijuana or the marijuana plant. Now, cannabis plants come in different strains or different varieties. And those different strains are indeed different genetic strains. So just as animals and humans have different genetic backgrounds and they can be crossed to one another to yield further genetic variation in the offspring, plants can be hybridized to one another in various ways through grafting or through the use of different types of seed combinations, etc., in order to generate different strains. There are also naturally occurring differences in the strains of plants, and the cannabis plant is no exception. So, for instance, in the context of a discussion about cannabis and its medicinal uses and recreational uses, we need to distinguish between the sativa variety, the indica variety, a variety called ruderalis that's not often discussed, and hybrids of sativa, indica, and ruderalis. Before diving into the different strains of cannabis and how they impact the brain and body both similarly and differently, I want to emphasize that the cannabis plant contains a number of different psychoactive compounds. Now, the most powerful of those compounds is THC. The technical name for it is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. But THC, as I'll refer to it, is just one of the psychoactive and biologically active compounds within cannabis plants. There's also CBD, which is technically referred to as cannabidiol, and cannabidiol, CBD, is known to be used for things like pain management, anxiety management, and other medicinal purposes. We will talk about the efficacy of CBD for those purposes, as well as some of, believe it or not, some of the dangers of CBD, depending on where it's sourced and the dosage, etc. So we've got THC, CBD, and also CBN, or cannabinol. CBN is less often discussed. You're going to hear a lot less about CBN-containing products out there, CBN-containing medicines, but it is relevant to today's discussion, so it will come up a bit. Now, I will be sure to provide more specificity to what I'm about to say, but very broadly speaking, THC is largely responsible for the psychoactive effects of cannabis. That is, the changes in mood, the changes in bodily state and sensation, etc. Whereas CBD, and to some extent CBN, have profound effects on the brain and body, but they don't tend to give people the sensation of altered perception, altered mood, etc. Some people might say they are not the component of cannabis that, quote unquote, gets you high. Although today we will really drill into what the high itself represents in terms of chemical systems in the brain and body. And what we will soon learn is that what we think of as being high actually includes a number of different changes in the brain and body, some of which can be best explained by CBD, not by THC, which runs counter to what most people out there know and believe. So broadly speaking, we have THC, CBD, and CBN. But I want to point out that the cannabis plant has over 70 different psychoactive compounds, many of which still have not been studied in isolation and in detail. So there's a big future of research for cannabis and for THC and THC-related psychoactive compounds, as well as for CBD and CBN. Today, we're mainly going to focus on THC and CBD, as I mentioned before. I should also point out that the cannabis plant has over 400 biologically active compounds. So these are biologically active compounds that may or may not have psychoactive properties, that may or may not be useful for pain relief, etc. Again, there is a vast landscape for exploration of the cannabis plant and of hemp for what they include that could be beneficial to us or detrimental to us. So again, a lot more work to do. Today, we're going to really try and stay on target with what we already know, and where there are certain exciting mysteries or intriguing mysteries about what we ought to explore more, I will certainly highlight those. Let's go back to the different strains of the cannabis plant, sativa, indica, and ruderalis, and explore how each of those differentially impacts the brain and body, because therein I think we can start to learn a lot about this incredible plant that is the cannabis plant. And whether or not you are a user of cannabis or whether or not you are entirely opposed to cannabis use, understanding how cannabis works in the brain and body itself is absolutely fascinating and can teach you a lot about how your brain and body work at a basic level, and can tell you a lot about how your brain and body will react to different life events and how your mood is established and stabilized and how your appetite is established and stabilized and so on. So we have the three major strains of cannabis: sativa, indica, and ruderalis. And for sake of today's conversation, we can pretty much cross off ruderalis. It's not often consumed, and components of ruderalis are not often consumed for medicinal or recreational purposes. Let's focus on sativa and indica. People will consume the sativa variety of cannabis either by edible or by smoking cannabis, or they will consume the indica variety of cannabis, again, by edible or by smoking cannabis, or sometimes they will take it in a transdermal form or a sublingual form. There are a bunch of different ways to get the cannabis into the body, but there's a clear distinction between sativa and indica that actually shows up first in the structure of the plant. At their extremes, meaning in a pure strain of sativa, it tends to be a taller plant, a longer stalk, believe it or not, and actually the length of the leaves is quite a bit longer. Whereas the indica plant tends to be more short and stout. And for those aficionados out there, I'm sure you know a lot of the other specific features of sativa versus indica. But already what we're talking about is the same plant, cannabis, with two very different morphologies or shapes. You might say, well, why is this interesting or important to how it affects me or affects other people for medicinal or recreational purposes? Well, it turns out that even though they are the same plant, these two different genetic varieties, because of the way that they grow and the way they capture sunlight and the way, believe it or not, that the different plants within that strain interact with one another, because believe it or not, plants are interacting with one another, they actually bring different elements of the psychoactive compounds to different components within the leaves and the so-called buds. The takeaway is that when consumed, and when I say consumed, I want to be very clear, I don't necessarily just mean oral consumption or eating cannabis sativa by edible. I also mean smoking it, and that could be, people will, just like with tobacco, the way that they bring the psychoactive components into their bloodstream and into their brain and body is to essentially heat the dried leaves of the cannabis plant. Then the heat liberates some of the psychoactive components that when inhaled into the lungs, because the lungs include a lot of vasculature, a lot of basically blood vessels and capillaries, that the psychoactive components are actually directly absorbed from the lungs into the bloodstream and then can cross into the bloodstream and permeate throughout the body and cross the so-called blood-brain barrier. So in other words, burning the plant liberates the smoke that contains the psychoactive compounds, and those are inhaled into the lungs and then get into the brain and body and act on the brain and body. And the major effect of sativa varieties are to create a high, if you will, and I'm putting this in air quotes for those of you that are listening, but to also act as a stimulant. The sativa varieties tend to make people feel kind of invigorated, somewhat alert. It doesn't tend to be as much of a sedative as some of the other varieties. Some people report heightened sense of focus or heightened sense of creativity. We'll talk a little bit later on as to whether or not they actually are achieving heightened levels of focus and creativity, or whether or not they just perceive themselves to have heightened levels of focus and creativity. The sativa varieties tend to make people feel a little bit less susceptible to pain and noxious stimuli, which are basically stimuli that you don't like. So the sativa varieties are often prescribed or are used in the recreational context for pain management and relief. Basically, the sativa variety is known to include a sort of head-biased effect. So here we're talking about subjective effects, and of course these will vary from one individual to the next. Some people will smoke cannabis sativa or ingest cannabis sativa orally and will feel an entirely different array of effects. But most people, the majority of people, experience a sort of head-centered high alertness, focus, and a sense that they're more creative. Contrast that with the indica varieties of cannabis. And when people smoke or eat or ingest indica varieties, the psychoactive components of indica, and again, this is pure indica, so not hybridized with sativa at all, but just pure indica, tend to lead to more full-bodied effects. People report feeling more complete full-body relaxation, more of a sedative effect. Indica cannabis is often prescribed and or used recreationally in order to achieve a state of sleep or to help relieve anxiety. So less of a stimulant effect. And we will talk about why, literally the underlying neural circuits that lead to the sativa variety causing more of a elevated mood and a head high, if you will, and the indica varieties being more full body relaxation. One of the ways to remember the distinction between the effects of cannabis sativa and cannabis indica was relayed to me by a friend who actually was a chronic, meaning every day, all day, consumer of marijuana. He basically smoked marijuana for 20 years before quitting about 4 or 5 years ago. And he said that indica is often referred to as in the couch, meaning laid back in the couch. And that can help you remember that the indica varieties of cannabis do tend to be more sedative in their effects. Okay, so there's sativa and there's indica, and then now there are hybrid strains. So marijuana growers and people who specialize in creating novel varieties of the cannabis plant. Again, I'm using the words cannabis and marijuana more or less interchangeably here. They are very good at creating new strains of plant that might be 25% sativa and 75% indica, or vice versa, or 50-50, or 90-10. Essentially what's happening nowadays is that through plant biology, plant genetics, I should say, growers are getting quite efficient at creating a variety of different strains of the marijuana plant that give rise to very nuanced and distinct effects on brain and body. In fact, so much so that there's now a new nomenclature, a new language emerging around cannabis and the development of novel strains of cannabis for medicinal and or recreational purposes. And while this might sound a little bit medical or a little bit clinical to some people, believe it or not, this is the nomenclature that's now typically used. People still refer to the sativa, indica, and hybrid strains, but there's now also a description of so-called type 1, type 2, and type 3 strains for any given sativa, indica, or hybrid strain. Okay, so just to put this clearly in your mind, you've got sativa varieties, that is pure sativa varieties. You have indica varieties, again, pure indica, and then you have hybrid varieties. And beneath each of those, you have type 1, type 2, and type 3 strains of indica, sativa, or hybrid varieties. What are type 1, type 2, and type 3? Well, type 1, type 2, and type 3 strains are strains that have varying amounts or ratios of THC to CBD. So for instance, type 1 strain. So for instance, you could have a pure sativa type 1 or a type 1 pure sativa or a type 1 indica. Those are going to have the greatest amount of THC relative to CBD. And I really want to emphasize this. Understanding the ratio of THC to CBD can help explain a lot or even predict a lot about how a given strain of cannabis will impact somebody. For instance, because THC is largely responsible for the typical psychoactive components of cannabis. So what I mean here is if somebody's ingesting sativa and it routinely makes them feel more energized, elevates their mood, it gives them a heightened sense of creativity. If that's what they experience and they're taking a type 1 version of that, that means that it's quite rich in THC and very little CBD. However, if they were to take a type 1 version of sativa and it feels far too strong, like too much energy, or they felt like they were too much in their head, nowadays there are strains of sativa that have been genetically engineered. And I don't mean by an engineer tinkering away with, gene engineering in a kind of CRISPR creating mutants, but literally by hybridizing, crossing different plants to one another, okay, creating in a natural context, the same way plants in the outside world would sometimes hybridize to one another, creating a variety that's perhaps type 2, which is going to have less THC and more CBD, or a type 3, which is going to be very high CBD and very little THC. And the same is also true for the indica varieties. So I want to make sure that everyone understands this because it becomes very important for understanding the biology of cannabis and predicting positive versus negative effects of cannabis.